All right. Welcome everybody to day 5. Hope you're having a great experience so far and making great progress with your teams. I'll say it's been amazing for all of us over the last few days, getting to know you better and really kind of understanding better the why, why you were called to this category and why you're so passionate about your ideas. So here we are, we got the weekend. I know most of you are working full-time jobs, so kind of been doing as much as you could around the edges and really now have the weekend to dig in full-time, building out product, tech, customer, and of course, tightening up that pitch. But before we get cranking, we have a real highlight. I mean, tonight we'll be hearing from Metaverse OG Philip Rosedale, the founder of Second Life, and Spencer Rascoff, serial founder, builder, and investor. But before we do that, we're going to check in on how the next 48 hours will play out. We're going to start with Ed Fries tomorrow at noon. Really special to have Ed. He's an absolute legend in gaming and is now backing Web3 and gaming startups through OneUp Ventures. The conversation with Ed will be about what he looks for in founders and the projects he backs. And it'll also be great. We'll dig into some of the things around what he looks for in a pitch. So this will really tee up nicely as we lead into the next section of the day tomorrow, which will be pitch practice. And so the way this will happen is pitch practice will be from 1 to 4 tomorrow, so coming right out of the conversation with Ed. And then all teams will have 10 minutes total, 5 minutes for the pitch, and then another 5 minutes from on feedback. We're going to have a great set of people. So we have Madrona, MVL, and then we have founders who've been through the process of fundraising who will give feedback on these pitches. So really help tune those up leading into Sunday. And then final pitches, of course, are on Sunday starting at 3 o'clock. It's a 5-minute pitch, no Q&A. We're going to go alphabetical order based on the team name. So that's the way we'll structure the actual pitches on Sunday. And as we talked about, we've got a great group of VCs who've already RSVP'd. And again, these are VCs who've self-selected and really focused on this Web3 category. So it should be super relevant for them and for you. And excited about that culminating event on Sunday, of course. All right, so a little bit more on the judging criteria. 5 key things we're looking at. 1, the problem space. Why there's a unique problem to be addressed and your insights around why this is the problem you're going after. The second piece is around the value proposition. I think it's so important here to make clear why Web3 plays an important role in the solution, why it's a better product or solution for consumers using the principles of Web3. So I think that's one thing to really key on that part. Second, the tech, the product, showing that some companies are further along, obviously. You're going to have a product to show. Others, it might be wireframes that show. Articulating the technology and the product will be important. The next one, business model, self-explanatory there. Are you going to make money? And then this is, I think, maybe the most important for many teams and our pitches is the team. This is why we put this event on, as we've talked about. We've just been blown away by the quality of people drawn to the category. And I think that's a real signal that this is going to happen. This movement is on the right track because some of the most ambitious, talented founders are attracted to it. But tell your personal story, your background, why you were drawn to it. A lot of what we've been talking about this week, I think it's important that comes through in the pitch. So those are some key things to highlight. Also think it's important, we don't have this in here, but to be clear about the stage. We've talked a lot about, we have teams who, super early on their idea, kind of, napkin level, kind of conceptual level, all the way to other teams that have been working for several months and have even raised funding. So being clear with the judges on the stage you're at will be super important. All right. And a little bit about the judges. So we have 3 judges for Sunday, all of which have a connection experience in the Web3 space. Soma, who's a managing director at Madrona, has led Web3 investments. Ari, who's an investor at Yellow Umbrella and leads the Cascade Blockchain Council, has a ton of depth. There's about 1,000 people in that organization, a ton of depth in the category. And then Sadie, who is a co-founder of Macara, a company that just sold to Betterment. She's also the CEO of Strix Leviathan, a crypto hedge fund. So Sadie's got a lot of exposure and experience. So ton of relevance with this judging group to evaluate your ideas, and excited to have you in front of them. All right. So the moment we've been waiting for, the main event. So the way we're going to do this is I'm going to introduce Spencer, and then he will introduce Philip, as this is being recorded as part of a podcast for .la, for Spencer's .la. So I'm going to jump right in and welcome Spencer to Launchable Web3 Startups, and give you a little intro on his background. So many of you know Spencer from his first act, co-founder of Hotwire, which was acquired by Expedia, and then part of getting the Expedia gang back together at Zillow, where he was CEO for a decade. And it'd be reasonable to think, given that epic run, time to relax, take some time off, chill, but not Spencer. Since then, his second act has maybe been even more impressive. Through his startup studio, 75 and Sunny, he's backed companies like Recon Food, Q, and Pacaso, which I think Pacaso was the fastest startup to reach unicorn status of all time. I'd heard that at some point. And also just, I've got to admit, like totally addicted to binge scrolling Pacaso homes. They're amazing. So if you haven't checked it out, please check it out. Spencer's also been providing mature companies an alternative to the traditional IPO process through his Supernova SPACs, which have raised over $1 billion in capital. But if that wasn't enough, he's also been teaching courses at Harvard from startups from ideation to exit, and another class at Harvard Business School, managing tech ventures. So he's been busy. But before handing it over to him, just want to say how grateful we've been at MVL. He's been an investor, an advisor. He's participated in events like this, and just been incredibly generous as part of our community here at MVL. So thank you, Spencer, and I'll let you take it from here.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks to MVL for putting this event together. Thanks everybody for joining, and it's so exciting and also kind of humbling to be in front of so many startup founders that are working on Web3 projects. I think I, like most of you, are probably learning this Web3 thing, this metaverse thing, kind of real time. And it's also new, and yet it's sort of not. And that's kind of where I want to start the conversation and bring in my guest, Philip Rosedale. So Philip he's sort of Mr. Metaverse, I guess you could say. I mean, it doesn't get more OG than Philip and Linden Labs, which was his creation, and Second Life, which came out of Linden Labs. So more than 20 years ago, Philip really created what was the first instance of the metaverse. And I'm just really excited to have you here, Philip, and talk to you about what you've learned over the last 20 years and what the next 20 years have in store for us. So welcome, Philip. Great to see you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. This is fun.
We share a VC actually, and a mentor in Bill Gurley, who was so instrumental to my career and to the growth of Zillow, and I know played a really important role in your career at Linden Labs. So why don't you, and we're here, the purpose of this event is to help all of these great startups that are preparing to pitch their Web3 ideas. So let's try to go back in time 20 plus years ago, and when you first pitched VCs, including Bill Gurley at Benchmark, what did you pitch in Linden Labs and Second Life, and what did they see in it when they decided initially to invest? Take us back to that original pitch meeting.
Well, now Bill, and you're right, he's such an amazing person, and it has been such a big has had so many strategic contributions, and was also a key, early believer. We wouldn't have succeeded without Bill and Benchmark on board. Bill actually came in 2004, and we did our first round, which was a small round. in 2001. So there was kind of an interesting timing there where we got started and got launched, but nobody really got what we were doing. It was an incredibly hard thing to pitch. So the first thing I would say is maybe don't feel bad if you're out there. Like there are a lot of these genuinely new ideas that are really tough to pitch. And I know we all talk about that a lot, but this was definitely one of those where the basic idea of Second Life as a big open space that people could build in, which especially at the time felt even more abstract than it does now. Just the very idea that people would do something other than say play a video game on a computer, in 3D, the idea that they would just live there, build things, try to make money, do all this stuff was a pretty foreign idea. But I have to say with Bill, he had a unique experience, which, he's probably told you about, where he went to China in, I think, 2003, early 2004, and among other things, learned about this thing called the QQ coin, which was part of Tencent, and how this virtual currency was being used so successfully in China as a way for people to participate in all kinds of sort of microtransactions and also to be creative. And so when he heard what we were doing, it was kind of like over before it started. He just said, and of course he had the experience of eBay, which in many ways was so similar to kind of similar to what we were doing. And so as soon as he saw what we were doing, that we had our own currency and that you could make things in Second Life, I think he just said, well, I know what he said. He just kind of said, we're all in. A classic Bill Gurley moment. I'm going to put a number on a napkin here for you, and that's what I'm willing to pay, and we're all in if you want to do it.
It's fun now that we can all watch Super Pumped and see a Hollywood version of Bill, and so everyone can sort of imagine that moment based on that. So you made an important decision early on with Second Life, which was the blank slate, essentially, right? So and it's a little bit different than some other metaverses that have started with more building blocks. Describe that product decision, what worked about that and what didn't.
Well, I had a background in physics and I had an interest in building block type environments, So the thing that I couldn't get out of my head that made me start the company, and that, well, in fact, I had been dreaming about starting the company in the early 90s and didn't feel that it was possible because 3D wasn't something you could really do with computers until about 1999. But yeah, I had this vision that if you gave people the right Lego blocks and you did it in a virtual world, they would just build all manner of different things. And so sort of the two components that I felt were required was the building blocks themselves, so that people could build interesting things, and then some sort of an economic system to back it so that if they built things they wanted to trade with each other, they could easily do that. So yeah, really that was kind of two fundamental concepts. But you're right, and I think it's a really good point. There was and continues to be this collision between the idea of letting people be creative in an open sandbox or in an open, canvas, and marketing things to people, say, in a new form, from the real world. So a lot of the stuff that we see today is like brands trying to do things on top of games, and sort of maybe that's a metaverse. But yeah, there's a real tension between doing stuff that is importing, pre-existing content and then presenting it to people, and letting people really actually build anything they want. So,
if you think of the big tech successes of the last 20 years, many of them have this commonality, which is people have built businesses on top of them, right? So Airbnb, Google, of course, Facebook, YouTube, the whole influencer creator economy in Snap and TikTok and Instagram. And yet, obviously, with Web3, we have a new kind of model, right? Where not only can these creators earn from what they create in world, but they also have true ownership of what, of their identity, of their data, of their transaction history, of like everything about themselves. So take us back to how Second Life differentiated between those two aspects of how creators can monetize their creations, and I guess show us how we transition from Web 2 to Web 3 through the lens of how creators monetize their own creations.
And I think some of my vantage point here naturally does come from being older and having been there as a young entrepreneur right at the start of the internet, that, that 1994, I got out of school in 1992, moved to San Francisco in 1994. So I was there kind of for that very first wave of the net. My perspective on it, and maybe it's a little different than some people's today, is that Web 1, so to speak, people putting up websites, was really very decentralized. That is, you were very much in control of everything you did. And in fact, that was part of what was so exciting about the internet. You got a domain name, you put up a server. In many cases back then, the server was literally, in your office, connected to a high capacity line, which I know you remember as well. And then later we started using other people's systems for that. So this Web 2 stage of intermediaries that are involved in, making these things work, in my mind, is almost kind of a recent thing. Like it feels to me that some of the intermediation that's happened that we are talking about kind of burning down now with something like Web 3 are things that, in my mind, are still kind of recent themselves. And the internet underneath them, even today, is still a very self-owned, sort of sovereign thing when people build services. But I do think that, big social media platforms and platforms that are enabling monetization in different ways can sometimes, kind of get in there. But it feels to me a little bit like we're having this Web3 conversation, in some ways aspirationally right, but I wonder, aren't there ways to do a lot of distribution and decentralization already? I look at something like ENS, the Ethereum name system, and then I look at DNS and I sort of ask, what's the difference?
Right.
So maybe I'm a bit of a contrarian, but yes, I think that for Second Life, though, we made a decision early on to fundamentally enable people to do anything they wanted to in real time in the space without our permission. And then we made an additional statement, which was just after Bill invested, that was one of the key turning points for the company, where we actually went to this legal conference in New York called State of Play that was about games and about how games did legal issues, like when people got in fights in game, how much did games claim or control the legal and regulatory rules around themselves? And we went up on stage and said, look, we got a completely different take on this. We don't own anything. We're trying to build a system that in which, this is your place, your content. We've got no claim over it except maybe to take screenshots. And we're going to be really aggressive about making that point. And that was actually one of the things that kind of, I guess in a way similar to Web3 today, lit up everybody wanting to talk about what we were doing and really helped launch us as a company. So it was a big deal.
Yes, I mean, that's very reminiscent of NFTs and how, if you own an NFT, you own everything about that, right? I saw the founder of Bored Apes say the other day something like, she's like, we need to actually license the IP back from you if we even want to use that screenshot in our own marketing, right? Because you
know exactly what we said.
It's such a mind bender. But again, like you created that 20 plus years ago, that concept.
Yeah. And that idea of the NFT, by the way, every little building block in Second Life, if you right click on it, opens up a little window and it has this thing called, people call it copy mod transfer, CMT. So that was sort of our NFT. So back in 2002, we had whether an object in the world that was sitting in the virtual world had these flags on it that you could set or, check or uncheck if you were the creator. And it was that each one of those little objects, and, every little cube in Second Life has this on it today, had who created it, who currently owns it, and if it's available to be transferred or sold to somebody else, what are the rules on that? So rules like, can you make multiple copies of it once you buy it? Can you retransfer it to somebody else once you buy it? And so that concept of alienable digital assets, to I think use what was Lawrence Lessig's term that he advised us about, and I think captures it best. That was a very exciting idea and one that we went after hard. And I think it was pretty incomprehensible back then.
So what aspects of Second Life achieved their full potential in your view, and where did you not achieve your full potential and why?
Well, obviously the big thing with Second Life is, why are there only 1 million people there? Why aren't there 100 million people there? And that's exactly the question that all the metaverse companies have to ask today.
Right. And so why are there only 1 million people on Second Life?
Because it doesn't work for grown-ups yet. I mean, how many of you are routinely, why didn't we have this meeting in a metaverse?
Right.
Because it wouldn't be good enough. We want to see each other's faces. We don't want to be avatars.
Well, is that so? So, what are the product decisions or the strategy decisions that were made at Second Life that brought us to a place in 2022 where it's not 100 million users? Like, is it too hard to build? Can you not monetize enough? Is it focused on the wrong demo or a smaller demo? Like, well, why isn't it 100 million?
Well, first of all, I mean, let me say as the founder, I'm not sure. I mean, it's been a very interesting ride, and Bill and I had a great time talking about this the other day on a podcast. We were reminiscing about this, and at the time we were all banging our heads on this. But I'd say there's easy things and then hard things. Let me start with the easy ones. The easy ones are when you're communicating with a group of people as an avatar. It's a very unique and demanding situation where as human beings we remember what it's like to be face to face with people, or at least most of us do nowadays still. And, the requirements for an online system to capture face to face interaction in a way that's adequate for us under different circumstances is a pretty high bar. And we're still not there yet. We don't use Snapchat filters right now, and there's a good reason for that. They're simply not good enough. They're amusing to make videos with, but they're not acceptable for face to face communication, especially when you're meeting somebody for the first time, by the way. So, what happened at Second Life was we were good enough for people that were committed enough to really want to kind of live there, and in many cases to give up their kind of real life identity and sort of project themselves wholly into a virtual world that they could call their own. Now, what I think we did right was, just as we just touched on, we gave them enough power and ownership over the space. We did things like open source our client early on too, by the way. We did a lot of stuff to really make it the property of the people that are there. So I think we did just enough to kind of get a fire started there. And, we still got 1 million people, in there today, which is as many as we ever had. It's about as big a community as we got to. And people have stuck around for 15 years in there. But what I think we didn't do, and I think nobody has done yet, is get the technology working well enough to kind of go beyond Zoom, if you will, to get a bunch of ordinary, randomly chosen people from the street, to enjoy standing in a group together and communicating. That's the part, and I could go on for hours about what has to happen, because I spent the last 10 years, my company called High Fidelity, banging my head on trying to make that work with VR headsets. Could we make a VR headset a good enough experience to put normal people in a meeting? And of course, Facebook thinks we can, and we're all seeing videos on mainstream TV about that now. But I can tell you, as being in the middle of it, it's not good enough yet, and VR headsets aren't good enough yet for us to have normal meetings there.
Well, so it's the perfect segue into the future, from the past. So, what is your vision of the metaverse at this point? You've been in it for a long time.
Yeah.
What will it be in 5 years? What will be in 15 years? And then we'll come back to which companies and business models do you think will flourish? But just from a consumer standpoint, like, what will the metaverse be?
Well, the first thing I would start with is what are we talking about when we say metaverse? I think there are two big changes that are technologically driven that are important and are completely different from each other. And let me say what they are. The first one is transitioning from 2D to 3D. I think as entrepreneurs, we have a vague sense, and I think it's vaguely correct, right, that a lot of the things that we do in 2D on the internet today, which is most everything, right, could have some three-dimensional representation. So instead of having a store that was a list of items on a screen, we could have a store that was actually a a three-dimensional space you walk through. Mm-hmm. That transition from 2D to 3D, I think, is a very valid thing to discuss. And I could go on for hours about the psychology of it and the science of why we remember things better when they're in 3D, blah blah blah. Mm-hmm. But that's one thing. But it's separable from this other thing that is a technology change as well, which I think is more important. And the other thing is making the internet live. So, when you're on a web page today, you have no sense that there's anybody else browsing that site.
Right.
When you're on Zillow, it's such an exciting experience, right? But you can't, you're browsing properties, right? And you can't turn to the left or the right and say, oh, there's somebody else who's looking at it.
You've got some e-commerce sites, like the travel sites, do a good job of trying to create FOMO by saying, or even open tables,
yes,
saying, how many times has it been booked, or how many people are looking at this hotel right now. And you're like, oh my God, I need to book it because there are 83 other people looking at it.
Yeah. So if you just think, like, forget about 3D, but just imagine imagine, and I mean, I really say imagine because I think nobody knows exactly how we're going to do this, right? But imagine something where, yeah, every site, every commerce site or whatever had the ability to be there together with other people.
Yeah.
What would the rules be on that? What would moderation look like? What would governance of that look like? How would everybody, flock to a website? Would the website be responsible for supporting that? So I think that idea of making it live and kind of turning always on communication, getting groups, getting the human experience of always having other people around into the internet. That's actually the bigger transition that we're going through. So I think when we think about metaverse, we're thinking about some mix of those two things. And it's that second one that's both a bigger opportunity and harder.
What was your reaction when you heard Facebook was changing its name to Meta?
Well, I mean, my gosh, you can imagine I had a lot of reactions. And then as the months have gone by and people have kind of rediscovered all this stuff and, called me up and said, hey, what do you think? Well, I had a lot of different thoughts. The biggest thought that I had was, oh my God, not with that business model. And I happily, I was just at South by Southwest, and I sat in listening to Neil Stephenson talk about his latest book. But somebody asked him about the metaverse, and he said the same thing I had said, which delighted me. He said, "Don't use that business model." And the idea there, right?
The business model of advertising,
yeah.
And why is that why is that not the right business model for the metaverse?
Yeah. Well, because today, of course, what that advertising model has become is a combination of surveillance, a combination of a lot of data about what you're doing, AI, in many cases designed to kind of entice you with something, modify your behavior, draw your eyes away from something else, right? And the difference when you take that to the metaverse, right, is in the real world we know where the ads are, so we can ignore them. And think what things would be like if that ended. Right. if you were literally in the real world and the person walking next to you might be an advertisement, mm-hmm. and the colors of the room were chosen to get you excited and you didn't notice it happening, So basically, and I'm not the only one, who's thinking about this and I think feels the same way. Fortunately, I think more and more people are. But I think the existential risk of putting human beings into 3D spaces where you don't know where the ads are and where they're empowered by the staggering amount of surveillance data that you can get. If you can hear someone's voice, if you can see where their eyes are, where their eyes looking, I mean, think what you can do, or think what an AI can do to influence someone. So I personally think that there is no way we can go even a little ways down that road. And we're going to have to, some combination of, I don't know what really, regulation, just good decisions being made, a kind of a shared sense of what the dangers are will get us going the right way on that. Now I just want to say the good news on that, because I say this every time, Second Life is a great business. We make a ton of money. We're still private, but Second Life makes more per person per year than Google does running ads on YouTube, or than Facebook does across its products running ads. So we make more dollars per person on a fees model, which is, of course, a lot of what Web3 is looking like it's going to be. So if Second Life charges fees on some things and not others, basic access is free, and we make more money than YouTube does serving ads to people. So there's definitely an ability to build a 3D world and make it a good business. So I think one motivation is just that it won't just be the obvious, oh, we have to use ads. I just think that's nonsense. And frankly, I mean, if you're old enough to remember, right? I mean, the ads are kind of a new thing. I mean, right. When I started Second Life, people ask, did you consider the ad model? And I'm like, no, actually, no, because Google had just started doing that stuff. I started the company in 1999. When I started, everything was fees. You charged. Right. You charge some sort of service fees for whatever you did.
It's really a mind bender, because advertising and Google AdSense in particular is what has sort of powered the web for 20 years or so. I mean, so many media sites and content sites monetize through Google AdWords or display advertising or programmatic ads. And if you're right that model doesn't work in the metaverse, then we need a whole new framework and paradigm to power the metaverse. So putting aside or moving from business models to business strategies within the metaverse, I'm really interested in understanding kind of what you think the right, pond to fish in is. So you've got the platforms, Second Life, Roblox, Rec Room, etc. Maybe Oculus, I'm not sure. You've got, picks and shovels companies that are trying to build infrastructure for the metaverse, just like, I don't know, like an Akamai was trying to build infrastructure or did build infrastructure for Web 1 in the 90s. And then you've got kind of this other thing sort of off to the side, which is crypto. And, Web3, metaverse, and crypto are these three buzzwords, and they all kind of interconnect in certain ways and not in others. But my very broad question is, what do you think is the most interesting and potentially lucrative area of opportunity within the metaverse and Web3? Which categories of companies?
Well, I think the challenge when we kind of talk about experiences is, first of all, there's two really big categories of use right now. Or one way of looking at this metaverse stuff, 1 2 by 2, if you will. There's kids and then there's grownups. Mm-hmm. And it's really important to note that a lot of the usage data that we're all looking at, trying to make assessments, the very question you just asked, is largely based on what 7 to 14-year-old kids are doing. Once kids age out of Roblox and Minecraft, they don't stay with it. I mean, how many people in this call are using Minecraft every day because it's cool? No, none. So that's something to really think about. The idea of the metaverse, of course, makes a ton of sense. And Second Life is at least something of a proof point around what you could do with it. And of course, there's great new products like VR Chat, for example, that are really interesting dives into that. But it's fascinating that a lot of the, maybe more than 95% of the hourly usage that we're kind of thinking about how to monetize here and what to do with is actually 7 to 14-year-old kids. Mm-hmm. So I think that's one distinction to make. So there's this question of like, how do we break through and get something that kind of takes these same broad ideas, but actually starts making them work for people that are grown up? How are we going to do that? So that's one thing I think of. Within that category, though, there's tons of things once you richly enable communication, right? That do make a lot of sense. Events, is certainly one that we've talked about. And again, the Fortnite, Travis Scott, lots of people maybe going to a live event. That I think is something that we're gonna get figured out. And of course, if COVID keeps suppressing, at least at some levels, our willingness to gather, in social groups, there's going to be additional pressure on that. I mean, I think COVID is the biggest externality that to some extent has driven the excitement around the metaverse, right? It's
driven this remote hybrid work from home world, which I think is permanent. Even once we're on the other side of COVID, even companies that require employees to go back to work or request them to, they're still going to tolerate a couple days a week of people working from home. And so we're all going to have to get used to some version of metaverse at work. And by the way, Zoom might be the biggest metaverse company that nobody talks about as a metaverse company. I mean, we are basically in the metaverse right now on Zoom. It's just 2D.
Yeah, I've always thought about, I said something at one point is like, I think Bill Tyer and I were having a conversation about this stuff. And I was saying, maybe the most valuable real estate in the world is this area behind me.
That's why I'm displaying a Pacaso, my own company, right behind me for the purpose of getting those questions to all the people on this call. Precisely.
So, right. The hours of use in terms of places where people gather, right? It's all Zoom, right? And so it's fascinating to almost kind of, back into it or, start from there. But I do think, like you said, if you actually look at what we've tried to do while we've been at home, right? Maybe it gives us some guidance. I mean, social events are really hard. And obviously a lot of the Web3 excitement is kind of vaguely around that, like, hey, you're going to go socialize, hang out, go to a museum, go to a show. What I always say to people, as a designer, that the great frustration or the great, sobering moment for me was that first 2 months in COVID when we all had those 2 or 3 sad happy hours with our friends and then gave up, right? Like we tried so hard, right?
Yeah,
Because
no, we
we
had game
wanted
night
to.
with our friends, and then
Yeah.
I had my poker game moved to Zoom, and that was kind of fun for the first 2 or 3 times. Then eventually we're like, this is stupid. Like, let's not do this. Let's just not play poker.
So
Um,
I mean, one thing
so
I'd say to
will the
yeah.
metaverse become engaging enough that we'll want to play poker and have movie night and hang out with friends in one of these environments in our lifetime? Do you think it will?
It will, but I do think it's tough sledding, and I think that for the people that are thinking entrepreneurially about it, that's exactly what lies beyond Zoom incrementally is exactly the thoughts to be thinking right now. Yeah, I mean, I think the blockers. Well, first of all, I think what we're doing here on Zoom. You start from here and you imagine, well, we can't all look like we're uncomfortably staring straight at each other, right? I mean, that's the first thing that's broken. That's just super bad. I can't do a breakout. I can't whisper to somebody here, So those are things that we can think about fixing. We've got to preserve, though, all of this information that we're transmitting to each other with our faces. I believe that's the problem. Like turning us into avatars, making us little, talking, bobbleheads or something is still not working for almost all, opportunistic use cases. But I think we will get there. We will do stuff. So one of the things I'm excited about is can we use information? I saw a startup today that, is doing stuff like if you put your hand up like this, it turns that into my hand is up to ask a question, So it's just using simple AI-driven, gesture recognition to do some things. Or if you close your eyes and you're sleepy, it starts giving the speaker, nobody's listening to you, signal. So I think there's stuff there.
So we'll open it up to Q&A in a moment through the chat. So please feel free to post questions there. I'll go there in just a minute or two. What role does crypto play in the growth of Web3 and the metaverse?
Well, I mean, that obviously is one of the most important questions of all. I mean, as you know, Second Life today, was kind of an original digital currency in a way. I won't say cryptocurrency because I think technically that means a different thing. But, we had our own currency that was freely and openly trading against the dollar and the euro and other currencies on open markets. There were multiple markets. We built our own. As well, way back in 2003, and today there's about $650 million a year in transactions that happens in Second Life. Typical transaction size is a couple of dollars. So crypto has a big role to play in there for a few reasons. One, you don't know what country somebody's from when you're an avatar, and you shouldn't have to. And so you need a way to make a payment to somebody across a border. You need to be able to pay somebody a small amount. Disregard that a Bored Ape is $250,000 or whatever, right? No, the typical transaction in Second Life is $2.
Wow.
So, and it makes total sense. I mean, there's no basis in costs for, my virtual glasses. And so they're typically around a couple of dollars. And there are designers that are making, there are thousands of people in Second Life that make full-time livings, making glasses and selling and hair and earrings and selling them to people. So, but at a size of $2, you need something that's even better than the crypto we have today, because obviously $2 plus $40 for the transaction fee wouldn't make any sense. There's also about 1.5 million, I think, transactions a day happening in Second Life. So you also need speed. We would overwhelm. Just Second Life would take both Bitcoin and Ethereum both down, in terms of transaction speed. But of course, things like the second layer 2 networks are going to make that work. So I think crypto has a huge role to play. I think there are immense risks for crypto, not so much in the metaverse, but personally as a thinker about this stuff, I'm much more concerned about crypto and wealth inequality. That crypto is absolutely going the wrong way on that, just as expected. Any economist will tell you that that's not a surprise, but crypto is making an even smaller number of people even richer than ever before, which is not what I think we need as a species right now. But as it relates to the metaverse, I think it makes a ton of sense. And this idea, certainly this ability for people to be creative and buy and sell stuff, 100% the driver of Second Life, and it will 100% be the driver of whatever happens with the metaverse.
So focusing on Web3 for a moment, I mean, let's talk about what you think Web3 is good for. And first, we'll define Web3, which is if Web1 is read-only, Web2 is read-write, and Web3 is read, write, own. And so it's a decentralized way of owning the creation that these platforms create. The thought experiment is, what if the drivers of Uber owned Uber instead of Uber owning Uber? Or what if the people that contribute photos to Instagram, they owned Instagram instead of Meta owning Instagram? So what do you think are the best use cases for the concept of Web3? Or asked another way, which Web2 companies are at most risk of being disrupted by a Web3 startup that is going to be hatched at a hackathon accelerator demo day like the one that we're here speaking at?
Well, I do think that something that's not very expensive but wants to have its provenance preserved and be transferred multiple times amongst people certainly does make sense. So I suppose the idea of a collectible from a concert, or even the ticket that you might use to get into a show, it does make sense to combine a cryptocurrency with a system of metadata that allows you to, recognize things as being digitally signed and, provable after the fact. I wonder what those small dollar items will be. Certainly with Second Life, we see an example of your appearance constructed as an avatar. And like we were touching on earlier, though, I think it's hard to get there. Eventually, yes, we are certainly going to go to business meetings and care what we wear, right, at those business meetings as avatars. And that does create the opportunity to have all of those little assets that we're carrying along with us, that are sort of in our wallets, be recognized in this way. I mean, whether a blockchain with its associated costs and fees and everything, and with this kind of, open, everybody's trying to screw everybody all the time, and, the costs end up being essentially an outcome of that. Whether that ends up being the right way to do things, I'm not sure. But, we're certainly seeing such a rich amount of investment and experimentation, in Web3. So many people have said to me lately, it feels like one of these things that's almost too big to fail at this point. Like something has to come out of it because of the amount of money that's invested in it now.
I mean, that's been part of my evolution on crypto as well. It's like at some point you feel like it has enough momentum on its own, and you start hearing from enough large financial institutions that they think they need 1 or 2% of their cash to be in crypto, and you start hearing from enough high net worth individuals that they think they need 0.5 or 1% of their assets to be in crypto. And then you see all this venture capital flooding in, and crypto in particular, but also Web3 feels to me a lot like the internet of the late 90s, which we both lived through, which is we all knew there was a lot of BS, at the time. And we all knew there were a lot of companies that were going to fail, but the general theme we knew to be true, that clearly things were moving from offline, from newspapers or magazines or other offline experiences onto the internet. Just figuring out which companies were going to actually make it, that was a little bit harder. And it feels sort of the same today, where
totally
this overall trend of Web3 and crypto is clear, but there are going to be a lot of companies that flame out, and probably venture firms that flame out during this. But the macro trend is right.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think as we both were there, that internet of the late 90s, it was so interesting, right? Because obviously it had, hyperbolic excess that was amazing. It was incredible. But at the same time, all of those websites that were going on, and it was a lot of websites, that were coming online, most of them did make sense. They had a clear utility, right? You were a general contractor, and you'd put up a website that explained in great detail with pictures, and it was easy to use and fantastic compared to a phone book, right? You put up a website. So there was an immediate utility, which was broadcasting information about you, your service, your company, that was unmistakable. And that's what I remember from 94. I didn't find it that interesting. I wanted to work on crazy, real-time communication and, simulation and physics. But that idea of just making your business better by getting a website, it was really true, right, for a lot of companies. And I think Web3 is kind of going to find what that feels like, but it's still sort of feeling around for it outside of financial speculation, right? I would say, by the way, that identity, this idea of your identity being richer and more easily portable, and being able to get into the club because you flash your ID, but it's a digital ID and it's tied to all this Web3 stuff. I actually think that's a really interesting space, partly because I think crypto needs to evolve to have a sense of who the people are, which I think is going to be critical for its growth, for security, for basic income, for all these different, things that we're playing with. But I think identity is an interesting space kind of broadly, not just as avatars in the metaverse.
There are a couple questions in the chat that are asking you to elaborate on how information will be consumed in the metaverse. If Web 1 and Web 2 are about browsers and web pages, what is the equivalent of Web 3? Like, what are the formats? Are we using VR goggles, or are we interacting with a phone or a computer? What is it in a browser or not in a browser? Like, how will we actually experience the
well, first of all, let me back up and say, with respect to the VR devices, and I'm sure we've got lots of people here that could meaningfully debate this, and I'm not sure, but I think we're 10 years away from a new computing paradigm where we have equipment attached to our face. I think that is ultimately where we're going, but stuff attached to our face is super hard. It's easier in VR because you can kind of isolate yourself and you don't worry so much what other people think looking at you with the headset on. Harder in AR, but either way, I think we're a long ways away from that. But I think the paradigm shifts that are driven, say, by the ownership model of Web3 are likely to come to fruition first on mobile devices and desktop devices. So I think there's a non-hardware range of the next 5 years where you want to take a look at what happens there. And so to get back to that question of sort of what's the medium, again, I think the important medium is actually live communication. I think what we're really talking about with the metaverse isn't shifting the broadcast model, from text to sound to videos or something. I think it's more, hey, how does this work if we're all actually back together again? Mm-hmm. Because the real world works that way. You walk into a store, somebody walks up to you and helps you. So what's that feel? How do we get to that online? And I think we do, and it's going to be fascinating.
So it's a perfect segue to this question that's in the chat, which is, many of the media portrayals of the metaverse paint a dystopian future. And remote work during COVID has also created a mental health crisis around the world and caused a lot of people to be depressed and disengaged. In what ways could the metaverse strengthen the real world social fabric? Like, where's the silver lining in all this potentially?
Man, I love that you asked that, because that's what I want to spend the rest of my career, trying to help with. So fundamentally, it's about whether we move toward each other or away from each other. That's the way I think about it. And by the way, that AI advertising thing, almost AI anything in the metaverse is dangerous, because do you really want to hang out with fake friends that aren't real, or are kind of like recordings of your friends, sort of bad recordings made by an AI of your friends that can sort of pretend to be kind of like them, but they're not actually there because they're doing something else? I think all of that is terribly dangerous, because what happens then is that we place less value and we have less of an understanding when we're actually communicating with real human beings after that, right? Because we've been sitting and, kind of having these fantasy advertising communications with avatars that aren't real. On the other hand, look at Second Life. People meet, fall in love, and get married in Second Life that have never met each other. And when they do meet each other, they're as connected as two, married people could possibly be. That, it's real. They really do get to know each other, and it's a real relationship. People cross cultural boundaries in Second Life. I've watched it. I have the emails. It's been part of the delight of the last 20 years. People that and sometimes I've almost come to have this feeling like, oh, geez, this is going to be so good. These two people who are polarized against each other are going to fall for each other as avatars. It happens all the time. So that's an example of where we can do the right thing. But fundamentally, I think we have to use technology to bring people closer together into a more intimate, real-time, present connection with each other. And we absolutely can do that. But it's a business choice, and we got to make sure the cards fall the right way.
If you're interested in this topic, by the way, the Eric Schmidt, Henry Kissinger book, which just came out, it elaborates a lot on this topic of in what way can AI bring us closer together or tear us further apart. And in particular, there's a very interesting and scary section of the book that talks about the impact that it's going to have on international relations and the way wars are fought. and things that we as a society need to worry about with respect to AI.
So scary.
So I guess that's the good segue into the role of government and regulation in the metaverse, Web3, and crypto. What again, as somebody who's been thinking about this for longer than many of the folks on this call have been alive, what role does the government play, or what role should the government not play as we move into the metaverse and Web3 technologies?
Well, obviously, as we saw first in Second Life, the boundaries between nations is blurred, by online. That's always been true. But if we move to something where we're kind of more present there as people somehow, as avatars, then those boundaries get blurred even further. So there's kind of a big, moment that I think the metaverse will kind of exponentially, double down on, of losing the sense of national boundaries and questioning what that means anymore. Regarding regulation and legislation, I mean, first of all, like legal frameworks, when two people sue each other in the metaverse, what's the domain? What's the legal domain for that? Question that's asked all the time in Second Life still doesn't have a good answer, right? So I think, but I think the right answer to that will be some sort of communal, sense of what the rules are in the metaverse as a country or something. So I think that generally recognizing that many of the regulatory frameworks, say governance frameworks of the real world, aren't really needed or applicable to this type of new world is a fair thing to go in. But I would stop at the sort of John Perry Barlow, ultra libertarian, governments are not welcome here. I don't think that's true either. I think look at Web3. I mean, I could go on for hours, but this idea of owning virtual real estate outright on the blockchain is a total non-starter. It's delightful as a speculative game that's being played right now, but as soon as you get people into a space where they can own plots of land that are adjacent to each other, here's what happens. You extort each other. Land is a perfect monopoly. So if you own land on the blockchain, and you have that last spot in town, what did we see that in, Up or something? The classic, the crotchety old man that lives in the house in the middle of the big city. Well, imagine what that goes like, how that goes in the metaverse where the ownership is on the blockchain. That guy gets to charge $1 trillion for that last space. So there's a kind of an extreme decentralization that I think doesn't work for a lot of real human interaction and commerce. And we're going to have to find a mix of maybe more decentralization than we've had before, but also some degree of democracy, community regulation, zoning, agreement amongst many parties about how things should work. I know that's probably heady, but that's what I think a lot about these days.
You're right, but I think given the fact that the U.S. government and really all Western governments are still trying to figure out how to regulate Web 1, we're still debating the pros and cons of Section 230, and
right.
There are sort of things that have been around for almost 30 years, certainly 25 years. I think we can assume that there will basically just be no regulation of the metaverse or Web3 for at least a very long time. And we'll see what that will be.
Personally, my dream, right, would be to start with no regulation and then very rapidly build from the bottom up, if you will, communal standards, democratic process, some of the things that people seem to be dreaming about with DAOs. I mean, I would only make the observation that when we talk about DAOs, I hear people use the word voting all the time, and I always want to put my hand up and say, that's not voting. And in fact, I ask my investor friends, what does it mean to vote? Is there a word for voting your shares? Because it's not voting. Voting according to how much stock you own is not voting. Not in the sense that it's important, right? The important sense of voting is each human being gets one vote. And I think, that aspirationally, we're kind of going in the right direction with these ideas, but we have to get all the way to people having a vote on things. But I think once we do that, my personal hope would be, I'm with you, the lowest level wiring, like you say, is pretty much self-defined to be kind of ungovernable. But I think what'll grow on top of that is social systems, democratic systems, strong identity systems in which actions have consequences, and there are social costs. I mean, if you get kicked out of a big group in Second Life today, that could have a serious effect on you. And that's a non-legal, non-government, non-regulatory thing. If a large community kicks you out and doesn't let you onto their land anymore, that could have a profoundly negative impact on your ability to exist there. So I think that I hope that we're going to see more layers put on top of these lowest ones we're trying to build. And again, like you said, even with Web 1, I mean, these are all components that are the bottom level metal components that enable individuals to come together in groups and have those groups have binding rules that apply to other people.
We only have time for one or two more questions. There are a couple of questions about Second Life's user-generated content economy. And I think people asking this, again, everyone listening to this event is building a Web3 startup, a startup of one sort or another. So I think people are trying to get at, how do you create the ingredients for these things to take off, to attract people, to create inside of these platforms, what works and what doesn't?
Well, one thing is having things all happen live. It's one point I would make. I think there's a kind of one of the magic things in Second Life that I still really haven't seen anywhere else. It's happened a little bit in some environments, but the building blocks themselves were manipulable live. So you could walk over to somebody and they appeared to be making some sort of a statue or something, and you'd walk up and say, "What are you doing?" And they'd tell you what their plans were, and hey, I'm in the middle of this thing. I'm going to build this great recreation of the Pantheon or whatever. There's something about live interaction where the creation process, the user generation process, is actually live and can be joined by others. There's something magical about that. So I'd say that's actually one component that's sort of not as obvious. And then the other two are an economy, like we talked about, a digital currency of some kind that can enable small transactions at a reasonably low cost, to the users of them in terms of fees and stuff. And then I think the other one is the building blocks themselves, and I think this is a little more subtle, need to enable creative self-expression in the right way. And I think it's one of those, it when you see it type things there. But, look at Minecraft, right? Minecraft is absolutely fascinating. I always say it's one of the most important things that happened, post Second Life that I would point to that is just fascinating, right? But would we all use Minecraft to create? No. It's a mental exercise. It's a thought experiment. As adults, nobody here would go and kind of look at that beautiful place you have behind you, Spencer. I mean, nobody would rebuild that place in Minecraft. Right. Kids would, but adults wouldn't. And so one of the things is that the creative tools have to be able to express the basic kind of needs that we have as people, to be attractive to each other, to build places that are spectacular, like the one behind you, to do things that are artistically and aspirationally rich. And I think that's always kind of a head scratcher. And it's easy to build something that's not that and then think it's going to become that, but it's not.
So last question, let's sort of end where we began the conversation, which is about you and your connection to Second Life. What caused you to return to the company that you helped create 20 years ago? And what do you hope to accomplish there now that you're back?
Well, I'm back as an advisor. So I'm very much part-time, but a couple of things. One is we had raised $75 million for High Fidelity and had built a big open source platform, basically, including a blockchain, by the way, that we built in 2016 for, trying to build a metaverse. And then we realized that because it was contingent on the success of the head-mounted display, that we were going to fail, and that the Oculus Quest and the HTC Vive and those devices were not going to be good enough to get a large enough population and a diverse enough population of people for us to survive. And so we had to start looking at what we were going to do. And in the end, one of the things that we did was we moved about 3/4 of our existing team over to Second Life. So one thing was to look at, well, where can we go with this group of great people where they can have a positive impact and continue to build in this space. And then, as I said, as we talked about earlier, the weird thing is if you're building stuff that's like games, more specifically games for kids, there's a lot of interesting work going on. But if you're building something that's for, adults to be expressive, there's not really a lot out there. So, Second Life was one of the logical ones to look at in terms of where that team would end up. And where I would end up with at least some of my time. And then I think the other one is like we touched on before is I, like so many other people right now, have a strong and genuine concern that we make decisions as technology entrepreneurs that are likely to keep the world around for our grandchildren. And This issue of fees versus ads actually really has weighed heavy on me. And I feel like I wouldn't put any energy, say, behind helping Facebook do what they're doing until I was convinced that they were going to do it in a way that would not cause harm to human beings. And I'm not at all convinced, yet. So I just think it's incredibly important that we do that. And so I think it made it easy. I wanted to make sure that we would do no harm in our work, in my own work. And so, that made the decision easier. But basically, also, we felt like Second Life was really kind of refining itself in the midst of the pandemic. And, Second Life actually has a secondary business, which is related to its financial business of essentially enabling digital currencies for everybody, that is actually going quite well independently of Second Life and this thing called Tilia. And so we were excited about that as well. So it made it I think a good call.
Well, Philip, you're a futurist and a legend, but what I like about you, I've always liked about you, is that you're building in the present. You're not just like thinking big thoughts and 10 or 20 years ahead, but you're actually building things here today that will impact tomorrow. So thank you so much for the conversation. It's really been a pleasure, and thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for doing this for me. It was great to talk to you. Thanks, everybody.
Mike, over to you.
Such a fascinating conversation. Really appreciate everyone's time. Philip, Spencer, inspiring for this group of founders. Appreciate it. Have a great evening.